ever passed through a place that felt wrong before you even stepped inside, where the air itself seemed to warn you to keep moving? Before we begin, tell me in the comments, what's the most unsettling place you've ever stayed overnight? A hotel? An old house? Maybe a friend's place that just felt off? Drop your story below while I tell you about something that happened in the Bayou country of Louisiana, back when the swamp still swallowed secrets whole and the law was more suggestion than certainty. This is the story of Prosper Guidry and the establishment he ran on the edge of Terrebonne Parish, a place that promised rest to weary travelers but delivered something far more permanent. It's a story that the locals still won't discuss after sunset, and once you hear what I'm about to tell you, you'll understand why some doors should remain closed, some hospitality declined, and some innkeepers left to their darkness. The year was 1872, and the roads through southern Louisiana were less roads and more suggestions carved through wilderness. Cypress trees rose from black water like the fingers of drowned giants, their branches draped with Spanish moss that hung thick as funeral veils. The air down there didn't move the way it should. It settled heavy on your shoulders, carrying the smell of decay and something sweeter underneath, something that made your stomach turn if you thought about it too long. The land itself seemed uncertain, caught between solid ground and swamp, never quite committing to either, just spreading out in a maze of channels and islands where a person could vanish and never be found. Where the main road from New Orleans bent south toward the Gulf, there stood a two-story structure that the locals called Guidry's Rest, though most folks who knew anything about it just called it the Bayou House, and they said the name with a kind of reverence you'd give a graveyard. Prosper Guidry had appeared in Terrebonne Parish sometime around 1868, just after the war had ground to its bitter conclusion and the South was still picking through the wreckage of itself. Nobody knew much about where he'd come from, which wasn't unusual in those days when half the population seemed to be running from something. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, though his face carried the kind of weathering that made exact age impossible to pin down. Tall and unnaturally thin, with shoulders that hunched forward as if he were perpetually walking into a strong wind. His hands were the most notable thing about him, long-fingered and restless, always moving, always fidgeting with something, picking at the edge of a table or worrying at a loose thread. His eyes sat deep in his skull, dark and wet like bayou water, and when he looked at you, it felt like he was measuring you for something, though you couldn't quite say what. He'd purchased the old Melancon property, a sprawling place that had sat empty since the fever of 1864 had taken the family. The house itself was built in that strange Creole style, raised up on brick pillars to keep it above the frequent flooding, with a wide gallery running around the first floor and shutters that hung crooked on their hinges. The wood was cypress, dark with age and moisture, and the whole structure seemed to lean slightly to the left, as if it were listening to something in the ground beneath it. Prosper had renovated the place with efficiency that bordered on obsession, working mostly alone through the humid months of 1869, rarely coming into town for supplies, keeping to himself in a way that made the locals suspicious, but not suspicious enough to do anything about it. By the spring of 1870, he'd opened his doors to travelers, advertising rooms at rates that seemed almost generous for the time, offering hot meals and clean beds to anyone making the journey between New Orleans and the coastal settlements. The first year of operation Nothing seemed amiss. Travelers would stop, spend a night or two, and continue on their way. Prosper kept to himself mostly, hiring a woman from town named Odette Thibodeaux to help with the cooking and cleaning. She was a widow of 32 years, strong and practical, who'd lost her husband to a logging accident and needed the work. She'd later tell the authorities that Prosper was a peculiar employer, but not an unkind one, that he paid on time and didn't make demands beyond the work itself. She noticed that he kept certain rooms locked always, told her they were storage, and she needn't concern herself with them, which she found odd, but not alarming enough to question. She worked there for nearly 2 years before she began to notice the patterns. It started with the drifters, men traveling alone, usually on foot, carrying everything they owned on their backs. They'd arrive at dusk, grateful for a roof and a meal, and sometimes they'd simply never leave. At first, Odette assumed they'd departed early before she arrived in the mornings, continuing their journeys before dawn to beat the heat. But then she began finding their belongings. A worn leather satchel in the room she was meant to clean. A pair of boots, good ones, tucked under a bed. A tin cup with initials scratched into it, sitting on a windowsill. When she'd mention these items to Prosper, he'd wave his hand dismissively and say the men had traded them for their lodging or left them behind intentionally, starting fresh with nothing but the clothes on their backs. His explanations were always reasonable enough to quiet her concerns, at least for a while. The Bayou country attracted a certain kind of person in those years. Veterans still wearing pieces of their uniforms, unable or unwilling to return to wherever they'd come from before the war. Freedmen moving through the South, trying to find work or family scattered by slavery's collapse. Criminals fleeing justice in cities where the law had started to matter again. European immigrants who'd heard about opportunities in Louisiana and found instead poverty and disease. All of them moving, always moving, following rumors of work or safety or just putting distance between themselves and whatever they were running from. They were easy to lose track of, these wanderers, and if 1 or 2 or 10 of them failed to reach their destinations, well, the swamps were dangerous. Bandits prowled the roads. Yellow fever still flared up unpredictably, and people died all the time without anyone noticing or caring much. But Odette was starting to notice. By the summer of 1872, she'd found belongings from at least 7 different men, all of them traveling alone, all of them having stayed in the rooms that Prosper kept locked between guests. She began keeping track in her own way, making small marks in the margin of her prayer book, a habit that would later prove crucial. The pattern was specific. The men were always alone, always on foot, always carrying their possessions in a way that suggested they had nowhere permanent to return to. They'd arrive in the evening, eat supper in the dining room, where Prosper would engage them in conversation with unusual interest, asking about their travels, their plans, whether anyone expected them at their destination. The next morning, sometimes the men would be gone, but their things would remain, hidden in corners where a casual glance wouldn't catch them. Now, let me ask you something, and be honest in the comments. Have you ever had that feeling when you're talking to someone and you suddenly realize they're asking questions that are a little too specific, a little too interested in whether anyone knows where you are? Leave a comment if you've ever felt that cold touch of recognition that something wasn't right about the conversation you were having. What Odette couldn't have known, what nobody could have known without entering those locked rooms, was what Prosper Guidry had been doing with his peculiar hospitality. The house had a structure that revealed itself only to those who studied it carefully. The main building, where guests ate and socialized, connected to the sleeping quarters through a narrow hallway that forced visitors to walk single file. The guest rooms were along the back of the house, facing the swamp, where the sounds of the bayou, the constant chorus of frogs and insects and night birds, would cover other sounds quite effectively. And beneath the house, in the space created by those raised brick pillars, there was storage, or so Prosper claimed, areas where supplies were kept dry above the occasional flooding. The truth was considerably darker. Prosper had modified the structure extensively during his initial renovations. Certain rooms had floors that could be lifted on concealed hinges, opening to the space below. The brick pillars created natural chambers, areas of deep shadow where the light never quite reached, where the damp earth remained perpetually soft. And Prosper had been filling those spaces with a dedication that bordered on compulsion, creating a repository of his guests that no one would discover until it was far too late. The break in the pattern came in September of 1872, when 3 men arrived together. They were laborers, German immigrants, who spoke broken English and had been promised work at a sugar plantation further south. They arrived just before sunset, road-weary and grateful for Prosper's hospitality. They took supper together in the dining room, and Odette, who was serving the meal, noticed something that made her skin prickle. Prosper was paying particular attention to one of the men, a fellow named Caspar Reinhardt, who was perhaps 28 years old, broad-shouldered and strong from years of physical labor. Prosper kept trying to separate him from his companions, suggesting there was a particularly nice room he could have, quieter than the others, but Caspar declined, saying he preferred to stay with his friends. That night, Odette did something she'd never done before. She stayed late, hiding in the kitchen after her normal departure time, watching through the crack in the door as Prosper moved through the house. She saw him check the room where the 3 Germans were sleeping, saw him stand outside their door for long minutes, his hand on the knob, listening. She saw the frustration on his face when he finally turned away, his long fingers flexing and curling like he was grasping for something just out of reach. She waited until he'd gone to his own quarters before slipping out of the house. But sleep didn't come easy that night, and the next morning she arrived at work with a knot of dread sitting heavy in her stomach. The 3 Germans left after breakfast, continuing south toward their destination, and Prosper's mood turned foul in a way Odette had never witnessed. He snapped at her over minor things, broke a plate against the wall over nothing at all, spent hours in one of the locked rooms doing something that created sounds she couldn't quite identify, scraping and dragging, and what might have been crying, but might also have been the house settling, or her imagination running wild. She finished her work quickly that day and left before sunset. Something she made a point of doing from then on, never staying past dark, never putting herself in the position of being alone with Prosper after the sun went down. 2 days later, another traveler arrived, a man who called himself Silas Devereaux, though the name had that practiced quality of something recently chosen rather than inherited. He was perhaps 35 years old, lean and nervous, with eyes that never quite met yours directly. He carried a small pack and wore a coat too heavy for the climate, the kind of thing a person would wear if they left somewhere cold in a hurry and hadn't thought to change. He took a room on the back side of the house, one of the ones that Prosper kept locked between guests, and Odette felt that same prickle of warning she'd felt watching the three Germans, a certainty that something terrible was about to happen, and she was powerless to stop it. She tried to warn him. When Prosper stepped out to check on something in the yard, she pulled Silas aside and said, very quietly, that he should consider moving on that same evening, that the roads were safer than staying here, that she couldn't explain why, but he needed to trust her and leave. He'd looked at her with those shifting eyes and asked what she meant, and when she couldn't give him anything concrete, anything beyond her gut feeling and her collection of abandoned belongings, he'd dismissed her concern as the superstition of a simple woman. He'd paid for 3 nights in advance and intended to rest before continuing his journey. That was the last time anyone saw Silas Devereaux alive, at least anyone who would admit to it. He took supper that evening, retired to his room around 9 o'clock, and by morning he was gone. But this time, Prosper made a mistake. He'd left the room unlocked, perhaps in his haste, perhaps because he'd been interrupted, and Odette, arriving early as was her habit, had pushed the door open to begin cleaning. What she found made her drop the linen she'd been carrying and back out of the room with her hand over her mouth, fighting the urge to scream. The floor was wrong. One section near the bed sat higher than the rest, slightly tilted, as if the boards had been disturbed and replaced incorrectly. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, the sweet, sick odor of decay rising from underneath. Silas's pack sat on the chair, untouched, and his coat hung on a peg by the door, but of the man himself there was no sign. Odette stood in that doorway for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, understanding finally clicking into place, the pattern becoming clear in a way that made her stomach turn and her legs go weak. She ran. Later, she'd barely remember the journey into town, her skirts hitched up around her knees, her lungs burning in the humid air, running like something was chasing her, though nothing was, at least nothing visible. She found the parish sheriff, a man named Augustin Boudreau, sitting outside the general store whittling a piece of cypress, and the words that came out of her mouth were barely coherent. Accusations and fears and descriptions tumbling over each other in a rush that took several minutes for him to parse into something actionable. Sheriff Boudreau was a practical man of 53 years, heavy-set and slow-moving, not given to quick judgments or hasty action. He'd been sheriff for nearly 20 years and had seen his share of violence and strangeness, particularly in the years following the war when desperate men did desperate things. He listened to Odette's story, with his face carefully neutral, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking a clarifying question, and when she'd finished, he sat quiet for a long moment, his knife still moving across the wood, making long, smooth cuts that curled away like ribbons. His response wasn't what she'd hoped for. He pointed out, quite reasonably, that drifters were unreliable by nature, that they often left possessions behind, that the smell could be any number of things: dead animals in the crawl space, mold, the natural rot of living so close to the swamp. He suggested that Odette's imagination might be running ahead of the facts, that perhaps she was letting the isolation of the bayou get to her, that women sometimes had nervous complaints that made them see threats where none existed. But he agreed, finally, to ride out to the Bayou house and have a conversation with Prosper Guidry, more to ease Odette's mind than because he believed anything criminal had occurred. They rode out together that afternoon, Odette and the sheriff, covering the 7 miles from town in heavy silence. The sky had that yellowish quality it gets before a storm, the air thick enough to chew, and the birds had gone quiet in the trees. When they arrived at the Bayou house, Prosper was on the gallery, sitting in a rocking chair like he'd been expecting them, his long fingers steepled under his chin. He greeted them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and invited them inside with a hospitality that felt practiced, theatrical, the performance of a gracious host rather than the genuine article. Sheriff Boudreaux explained that there'd been some concern about missing travelers, and he'd appreciate it if Prosper could show him around the premises, just to put everyone's mind at ease. Prosper agreed immediately, too immediately, and proceeded to give them a tour of the public spaces, the dining room and kitchen and front parlor, all of which were tidy and unremarkable. When they reached the hallway leading to the guest rooms, Prosper produced a ring of keys and began unlocking doors one by one, showing empty rooms with neatly made beds, clean floors, nothing to suggest anything amiss. But when they reached the room where Odette had seen the disturbed floorboards, Prosper hesitated. Just for a moment, his hand on the key, and Odette saw something flicker across his face, calculation maybe, or concern, something that suggested the performance was requiring more effort than it had a moment before. He unlocked the door and stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter, and when Sheriff Boudreaux walked in, he made a point of stomping heavily across the floor, testing the boards, looking for any give or hollow sound that might suggest something beneath. The floor was solid, perfectly level, perfectly normal, no sign of disturbance. The pack Odette had seen was gone, the coat was gone. The room looked like it had been thoroughly cleaned and prepared for the next guest. Sheriff Boudreaux turned to Odette with a look that managed to be both sympathetic and dismissive, and Prosper stood in the doorway with that smile still fixed on his face, his hands now clasped behind his back, the picture of patience with a hysterical woman's accusations. They left soon after, Sheriff Boudreaux offering his apologies to Prosper for the inconvenience, Prosper waving them away with gracious understanding, everyone performing their roles in a play that Odette suddenly understood was rigged against her from the start. On the ride back to town, the sheriff was gentle but firm in his suggestion that Odette might want to find other employment, that the isolation and the stress of working in such a remote location was clearly affecting her nerves, that there was no shame in admitting when a situation was too much for a person to handle. Now, before we continue, I want to pause and ask you something. Have you ever tried to convince someone of something you knew was true, but you couldn't prove it, where the evidence was right there, but somehow invisible to everyone else? Drop a comment about a time when you knew something was wrong, but nobody would listen. I'd love to hear your stories. And by the way, this story is being brought to you by Behind Dark Tales. If you're finding this disturbing, fascinating, or both, hit that subscribe button. And if you're hearing this on another channel, understand they've stolen our content without permission. Help us out by reporting them. We put a lot of work into researching and presenting these cases, and we appreciate your support in protecting that work. Odette didn't return to the Bayou house. She couldn't, not with the certainty she now carried that Prosper Guidry was something far worse than a peculiar employer. She found work at a boarding house in town, taking a significant reduction in pay, but money seemed less important than keeping herself away from whatever was happening in those locked rooms. She tried to put it behind her, tried to convince herself that maybe the sheriff was right. Maybe her imagination had run wild. Maybe the coincidences were just coincidences, and the smell had been a dead possum or rotting vegetation or any of the 100 things that could create an odor in a house surrounded by swamp. But she couldn't shake it, and she couldn't stop noticing. She began paying attention to the travelers who passed through town, the ones who mentioned planning to stop at Guidry's Rest on their way south. She'd watch them leave, heading down the road toward the bayou, and sometimes she'd see them again days later, and sometimes she wouldn't. She started keeping better records, writing names and descriptions in a small journal she kept hidden, marking dates and counting the absences, building a case that existed only in her own mind because nobody else seemed willing or able to see the pattern. The months rolled by, summer turning to fall, turning to winter, though winter in Louisiana is more a suggestion than a season, a brief cooling that barely registers before the heat returns. Prosper continued operating the Bayou house, his reputation spreading as a place of reliable hospitality, reasonable rates, and few questions asked. That last part was particularly attractive to the kind of travelers who had reasons for keeping a low profile, and Prosper seemed to welcome them all with equal enthusiasm, his long fingers ringing together like he was washing his hands of something only he could see. In March of 1873, a Federal Marshal named Cordell Whitmore passed through Terrebonne Parish on unrelated business. He was pursuing a counterfeiter who'd been working the river towns, producing fake banknotes good enough to fool all but the most careful examination, and his investigation had led him to Louisiana. He was a methodical man of 40 years, originally from Pennsylvania, with the kind of rigid morality that the war had somehow strengthened rather than destroyed. He wore his authority like armor, spoke in careful, measured sentences, and had a reputation for persistence that made criminals nervous and local law enforcement sometimes resentful. He'd interviewed Odette as part of his investigation. The counterfeiter, having passed through town months earlier, and in the course of their conversation, she'd mentioned her experience at the Bayou house. She hadn't planned to, hadn't thought he'd care about something outside his jurisdiction, but there was something about his careful attention, the way he took notes on everything she said without judgment or dismissal, that made the words spill out of her. She showed him her journal, the names and dates, the pattern of disappearances that looked undeniable when laid out on paper, but had been invisible to Sheriff Boudreaux when she'd tried to explain it months before. Marshal Whitmore listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification, his pencil moving across his notebook in quick, efficient strokes. When she finished, he sat quiet for a long moment, reviewing his notes, and then he asked a question that caught her off guard. He asked if she'd noticed any pattern to the timing of the disappearances, whether they seemed random or if there was a rhythm to them. She thought about it, reviewed her own notes, and realized that, yes, there was a pattern. The disappearances clustered around the new moon, when the nights were darkest, when the bayou was at its most impenetrable, when a person could scream and the sound would be swallowed by the darkness and distance before anyone could respond. Marshal Whitmore closed his notebook and told Odette he'd look into it. He didn't promise anything, didn't make grand declarations about justice or truth, just said he'd look into it, and left her with the first genuine hope she'd felt since that morning when she'd found the disturbed floorboards and smelled death rising from below. He spent the next week making inquiries, talking to people in neighboring parishes, checking records at the parish courthouse, piecing together a timeline of arrivals and departures that told a story most folks had been too busy or too disinterested to notice. What he found was troubling. Over the course of 3 years, approximately 32 men had checked into Guidry's Rest and never checked out, at least not in any official sense. Some of them had been heading to specific destinations where they'd never arrived. Others had been traveling without fixed plans, drifting through the South in that aimless way that made them nearly impossible to track. None of them had family making inquiries. None of them had left behind debts or obligations that would draw attention to their absence. They'd simply ceased to exist, and if not for Odette's meticulous record-keeping and Marshal Whitmore's willingness to take her seriously, they would have remained forgotten, their lives and deaths equally meaningless in the grand sweep of history. Marshal Whitmore requested assistance from the federal authorities, arguing that the disappearances might constitute a federal crime if any of the victims had been traveling interstate, which several of them had been. The response was slow, bureaucracy grinding at its usual pace, but eventually he received authorization to conduct a formal investigation. He brought in 2 deputies from the Federal Marshal Service, men who had no ties to the local community and no reason to protect Prosper Guidry from scrutiny. They descended on the Bayou house on a gray morning in late April, armed with legal authority and a determination to find the truth regardless of where it led. Prosper greeted them with that same practiced hospitality, but Marshal Whitmore noted that his hands were shaking slightly, that nervous energy that had nowhere to go expressing itself in tremors and twitches. They informed him they had authorization to search the premises, and while he couldn't legally refuse, the look that passed over his face suggested he was considering it, weighing his options, calculating whether resistance might serve him better than cooperation. In the end, he stepped aside and let them enter, retreating to the gallery where he sat in his rocking chair, watching through the windows as the marshals began their methodical examination of his home. They started with the guest rooms, all of them locked and unlocked, checking floors and walls and ceilings for any irregularities. They found the concealed hinges in 3 of the rooms, the floor panels that lifted to reveal the dark spaces below. They found the soft earth underneath, disturbed and replaced repeatedly, the smell of decay unmistakable once you knew to look for it. They found fragments of fabric, buttons, a few coins, a woman's brooch that seemed out of place until they realized it must have been carried by one of the men. Perhaps a gift for someone they'd never reach. Perhaps a theft. Perhaps a memory of someone lost. And they found the bodies, not intact, not identifiable in any conventional sense, but enough. Bones and decomposed flesh, mixed together in the damp earth, creating a charnel pit that spoke to years of systematic disposal. The marshals worked through the day and into the evening, carefully excavating the spaces beneath the house, documenting everything they found, the grim mathematics of murder laid out in fragments and remains. By the time darkness fell, they'd counted evidence of at least 23 different individuals, though the state of decomposition made exact numbers impossible to determine. Prosper Guidry was arrested without resistance. He sat in that rocking chair and watched them work, his long fingers folded in his lap, his face expressionless as the reality of his situation unfolded beneath his feet. When Marshal Whitmore finally approached him with irons, Prosper stood calmly, extended his wrists, and allowed himself to be shackled without protest. The only thing he said during the entire process was a question, asked in a tone of genuine curiosity rather than defiance. He asked how they'd known what had finally given him away after all this time of careful operation. Marshal Whitmore told him about Odette, about her observations and her record-keeping, about the patterns she'd noticed that everyone else had dismissed. Something flickered across Prosper's face when he heard this, not quite anger, but something close to it. Frustration, maybe, the irritation of a craftsman whose work had been undone by an oversight. He said very quietly that he'd known she was a problem, that he'd considered solving it, but that killing a local woman with connections in town carried different risks than disposing of nameless drifters, and he'd chosen the safer path. The way he said it, matter of fact and calculating, made it clear that he'd given the matter serious consideration, had weighed the options like a merchant considering an investment. The trial began in July of 1873, held in the parish courthouse in Houma. It drew spectators from across southern Louisiana, curiosity seekers and justice seekers, and those who just wanted to see what a monster looked like in daylight. Prosper sat through the proceedings with that same blank expression, neither defending himself nor showing remorse, simply existing in the space while testimony unfolded around him. The prosecutors presented evidence methodically, calling witnesses who'd seen various men arrive at the Bayou house and never leave, presenting Odette's journal with its careful accounting, describing the remains found beneath the house in detail that made several jurors visibly ill. The defense, such as it was, attempted to argue that the bodies could have accumulated through natural causes, that travelers died from disease and accident, and Prosper had simply buried them on his property rather than reporting them, that this was negligence perhaps, but not murder. The argument fell apart under scrutiny, couldn't explain the concealed floor panels and the systematic disposal, couldn't account for the pattern of disappearances that aligned so perfectly with Prosper's opportunities, couldn't overcome the sheer weight of evidence that pointed to deliberate and repeated killing. What emerged during the trial was a portrait of a man who'd found a sustainable model for his compulsions. Prosper had recognized early on that certain types of people could vanish without consequence, that the chaos of Reconstruction and the general disorder of the South created opportunities for those willing to exploit them. He'd chosen his victims carefully, men traveling alone, men without connections or destinations that anyone cared about, men whose absence would be noted by nobody. He'd refined his method over time, learning how to be the perfect host right up until the moment he wasn't, how to make his guests feel safe and welcome before ending them with an efficiency that suggested practice. The prosecution tried to establish a motive, some driving force that would explain why Prosper had felt compelled to kill with such regularity. They brought in a doctor who'd studied criminal behavior, who testified about moral insanity and degeneracy, using terms that would later fall out of favor, but at the time carried scientific weight. Prosper himself never explained, never offered insight into his thinking, simply sat quiet and still, while others tried to make sense of him. The closest he came to an explanation was during cross-examination, when the defense attorney asked him directly why he'd done it, and Prosper had looked at him with those deep-set eyes and said, very simply, that he'd enjoyed it, that the power of it had satisfied something in him that nothing else could, and that if he'd been allowed to continue, he would have. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on multiple counts of murder. The judge, a severe man named Thibodeaux, no relation to Odette, handed down a sentence of death by hanging to be carried out at the parish prison in Houma. Prosper received the sentence without visible reaction, was led from the courtroom in chains, and spent the next 2 months in a cell waiting for the execution date to arrive. During those weeks, several people attempted to interview him, journalists and clergy, and even a novelist who was writing a book about Southern crime. Most were turned away, but Prosper agreed to speak with a priest named Father Augustin Marceau, a young man recently arrived from France who'd taken an interest in the spiritual state of condemned prisoners. Their conversations, which Father Marceau later documented in letters to his superiors, revealed little new information, but painted a disturbing picture of a man entirely at peace with his actions, who felt no guilt or remorse, who seemed to view his victims as materials he'd used rather than people he'd destroyed. Father Marceau asked him about salvation, about the state of his soul, about whether he feared what awaited him after death. Prosper's response was that he didn't believe in an afterlife, that consciousness ended with death, and there was nothing beyond it to fear or anticipate, that morality was a construct people used to control each other, and he'd simply chosen not to be controlled. When the priest pressed him, asking if he felt any connection to the divine, any sense of a higher purpose or meaning, Prosper had laughed, a sound Father Marceau described as deeply unsettling, and said that if God existed, he'd created Prosper exactly as he was, with exactly these appetites, and punishing him for following his nature would be like punishing a snake for striking. The execution was scheduled for September 19th, 1873, at dawn. A gallows was constructed in the prison yard, a simple affair of heavy timber that creaked in the wind. A crowd gathered despite the early hour, perhaps 200 people, including Odette Thibodeaux, who'd traveled from town to witness the end of the man who'd nearly made her another victim. Marshal Whitmore was there as well, standing near the gallows with his notebook, documenting the final moments of his investigation with the same careful attention he'd given everything else. Prosper was led out at first light, his hands bound, his face calm. He'd refused a hood, saying he wanted to see the sky one last time, and the hangman had honored the request. He stood on the platform while a minister read final prayers, stood quiet and still while the noose was fitted around his neck, And when asked if he had any last words, he'd looked out at the crowd with those wet, dark eyes and said something that would be remembered and repeated for generations after. He said that they should burn the house, that the ground beneath it was poisoned now, that nothing good would ever grow there again, and that if they were wise, they'd salt the earth and abandon the place entirely. He said this not as a curse, but as advice, the way you'd warn someone about a dangerous animal or unstable ground, practical information delivered without malice. And then he'd nodded to the hangman and said he was ready. The drop was clean, the neck breaking instantly, and Prosper Guidry stopped existing sometime around 6:30 in the morning on a September day that would be remembered primarily for how ordinary it was otherwise, how the sun rose and the birds sang and life continued for everyone except the man swinging slowly in the dawn breeze. The aftermath was complicated in the way these things always are. The Bayou house stood empty for several months while the parish tried to decide what to do with it. The property technically belonged to Prosper's estate, but he'd left no will and had no known heirs, so ownership reverted to the parish. Several local families expressed interest in purchasing it, thinking the price would be low given its history, but every time someone would visit the property, they'd leave without making an offer, unwilling or unable to explain their change of heart. Odette visited once, driven by some need to see the place in daylight, to confront the location of her fear with the source removed. She found it exactly as she'd left it months before, the furniture still in place, the beds still made, everything frozen in time like a museum of horror. She walked through the rooms where she'd cleaned and cooked, stood in the doorway of the room where she'd smelled death rising from below, and felt nothing but a deep exhaustion, the kind that settles in your bones and makes every movement feel like pushing through deep water. She went beneath the house to the spaces where the bodies had been buried and removed. The earth had been dug up and filled in again by the authorities, but you could still see where it had been disturbed, darker patches in the dirt that held moisture longer than the surrounding ground. She stood there in the dim light filtering through the floorboards above and tried to feel something for the men who died here, tried to generate sympathy or grief or understanding, but all she felt was relief that she wasn't among them, that her caution and her observations had kept her alive while others had died. The house burned in November of 1873, under circumstances that were never fully explained. The official report called it an accident, suggested a lantern had been left burning or a spark from the fireplace had caught, but everyone knew the truth was more deliberate than that. Someone, possibly several someones, had decided that Prosper's final advice was sound, that the Bayou house needed to be erased from the landscape, and they'd taken matters into their own hands. The fire burned through the night, visible for miles, the cypress wood burning hot and fast, and by morning nothing remained but the brick pillars rising from scorched earth, standing like tombstones over an unmarked grave. The land itself was eventually sold to a timber company that harvested the surrounding cypress and then abandoned the property when the trees were gone. The brick pillars remained for years, slowly crumbling as frost and rain and vegetation worked to reclaim them, and local folks avoided the area without quite being able to say why. Just a general sense that the place was wrong, was marked, was best left alone. Odette lived for another 43 years, dying in 1916 at the age of 75. She never spoke publicly about her time at the Bayou House, declined interviews, refused to contribute to the books and articles that were written about the case. But her journal survived, passed down through her family, eventually donated to the Louisiana Historical Society, where it sits in an archive, available to researchers who want to understand how one woman's careful observation prevented countless additional murders, how paying attention to pattern and inconsistency can reveal truths that everyone else overlooks. Marshal Whitmore continued his work for the Federal Marshal Service, eventually retiring in 1898, with a reputation as a thorough investigator who never let politics or convenience interfere with justice. He kept a copy of the Guidry case files in his personal papers, and when asked in his later years about the most disturbing case he'd ever worked, he'd always mention Prosper Guidry, not because of the number of victims or the brutality of the crimes, but because of how ordinary the killer had seemed, how he'd hidden in plain sight simply by being polite and running a business efficiently. The question of exactly how many men died at the Bayou House was never definitively answered. The remains found beneath the house represented at least 23 individuals, but given the level of decomposition and the mixing of remains, the actual number could have been higher. Odette's journal documented 32 disappearances over 3 years, but she'd only been working there for 2 of those years, and Prosper had owned the property for 4. It's entirely possible that the killing started before Odette arrived and that there were victims she never knew about. Men who'd vanished in 1869 or 70 when Prosper was still learning his method, still figuring out how to dispose of bodies efficiently. And there's another dimension to consider, one that the investigators at the time didn't pursue, but that modern researchers have noted. The Bayou House sat on a major route between New Orleans and the Gulf settlements. Thousands of people would have passed by it during the years of Prosper's operation, would have seen the sign advertising rooms and meals, would have considered stopping. How many of them felt that instinctive warning, that sense that something was wrong about the place, and kept walking? How many of them are alive today or lived long lives and died of natural causes because they listened to that small voice that said, "Keep moving, don't stop here, find somewhere else"? The psychological profile of Prosper Guidry, assembled posthumously by researchers studying criminal behavior, suggests a man who combined careful planning with deep compulsion. He wasn't insane in any legal sense, wasn't hearing voices or suffering delusions, wasn't operating under any belief system that excused or justified his actions. He simply wanted to kill and had found a way to do it with minimal risk, had created a system that satisfied his urges while protecting him from consequence, and had operated that system with the efficiency of any successful business. What makes the case particularly disturbing is the sustainability of it, the way Prosper had identified a renewable resource of victims and had built his entire operation around exploiting it. He wasn't a killer who acted in passion or rage, wasn't someone who lost control and then had to deal with the aftermath. He was methodical, patient, willing to let opportunities pass if the risk seemed too high, capable of maintaining his performance as the hospitable innkeeper for extended periods between killings. The 3 German laborers who'd stayed together, denying him the chance to isolate one of them, had walked away without realizing how close they'd come to death, had probably told stories later about the friendly innkeeper in the Bayou who'd given them clean beds and hot food and sent them on their way with a smile. The site of the Bayou house today is barely recognizable as having once hosted a building. The brick pillars collapsed decades ago, reduced to rubble that's slowly being absorbed into the swamp. The vegetation has reclaimed everything, cypress and tupelo and water oak growing thick, Spanish moss hanging from branches that shade ground where men died and were buried and were forgotten. There's no marker, no memorial, nothing to indicate that this patch of Louisiana wetland was once the site of systematic murder. Local historians have tried periodically to raise awareness of the case, to mark the location in some way that would acknowledge what happened there, but the efforts have always stalled, partly due to lack of funding, but mostly due to a general reluctance to memorialize horror. There's a feeling, never quite articulated but widely shared, that some things are better left unmarked, that drawing attention to sites of evil might somehow validate or glorify the acts committed there. That silence serves as a more appropriate response than memory. But the case itself refuses to be entirely forgotten. It appears in academic studies of serial murder, in true crime databases, in discussions of how social disorder creates opportunities for predation. It's taught in some criminal justice programs as an example of how victim selection can determine whether a killer is caught quickly or operates for years. How choosing victims from marginalized populations who won't be missed creates a buffer of invisibility that protects the predator. It's cited in discussions of innkeeper murders, a specific category of crime where people who offer hospitality use that trust to select and kill victims, a pattern that appears across cultures and throughout history. The descendants of Odette Thibodeaux still live in Louisiana, scattered across the state, most of them unaware of their ancestors' role in stopping a serial killer. The journal she kept sits in climate-controlled storage at the Historical Society, its pages yellowed but still legible, her handwriting clear and precise, each entry a small act of documentation that accumulated into proof. Researchers who've studied it note how methodical she was, how she recorded not just names and dates, but also physical descriptions, items of clothing, anything that might later help identify the men she feared were being killed. She was building a case without knowing if anyone would ever care, creating evidence that would only matter if someone chose to take her seriously, and by some combination of luck and persistence, someone finally did. Father Marceau, the priest who'd spoken with Prosper before the execution, left the priesthood 2 years later, unable to reconcile what he'd encountered in those conversations with his understanding of human nature and divine purpose. He returned to France and became a teacher, spending the rest of his life working with troubled youth, trying in his way to prevent the creation of more men like Prosper Guidry. His letters about the conversations were published posthumously in 1932, part of a collection of documents related to Louisiana crime, and they remain deeply unsettling to read. A window into a mind that functioned according to logic that most people find incomprehensible. Sheriff Boudreaux, the man who'd initially dismissed Odette's concerns, lived with that failure for the rest of his life. He continued serving as parish sheriff until 1878, then retired and moved to Texas, where he died in 1884. His papers, donated to the parish archive after his death, include several drafts of a letter he never sent, addressed to Odette, apologizing for not believing her, explaining that he'd been trained to look for concrete evidence and had dismissed pattern and intuition as unreliable, acknowledging that his skepticism had likely cost lives. The letter was found among his effects, revised multiple times, never completed to his satisfaction, never mailed. The legal precedent set by the Guidry case influenced how Louisiana handled subsequent investigations of missing persons, creating a framework for taking seriously reports of disappearances even when the missing were transient or socially marginal. It wasn't a dramatic change, didn't revolutionize law enforcement overnight, but it planted seeds that would grow over generations into better protocols and more thorough investigations. Tiny improvements that accumulated into progress measured in lives saved that no one would ever know about. The broader question the case raises, the one that makes people uncomfortable even 150 years later, is how many other Prosper Guidrys existed in that period, operating similar systems in other isolated locations, taking advantage of the same social disorder and population movement to kill with impunity. The Bayou house only came to light because one woman paid attention and one federal marshal took her seriously. How many other establishments never came to light, where the staff was less observant, or the local law enforcement more dismissive, or the killer more careful about removing evidence? The years following the Civil War saw massive population movement across the South, freedmen searching for family, veterans returning home or fleeing home, immigrants arriving in ports and spreading inland, all of them traveling through a landscape where infrastructure had been destroyed and social order was still reconstituting itself. Record-keeping was sporadic, communication as between jurisdictions was poor, and the general chaos meant that people disappeared all the time for perfectly innocent reasons, making it nearly impossible to distinguish murder from misfortune. If you wanted to kill with minimal risk of detection, this was the perfect historical moment, and it's statistically unlikely that Prosper Guidry was the only person who recognized and exploited that opportunity. Modern criminal profilers who've studied the case note patterns that would later become familiar in studies of serial murder, the careful victim selection, the maintenance of a normal facade, the creation of a killing zone that the murderer controlled completely, the psychological satisfaction derived from power rather than from any rational motive like robbery. Prosper took money from his victims, certainly, whatever they carried with them, but the financial gain was incidental rather than primary. What he was really taking was their lives, their autonomy, their future, and the pleasure he derived came from that absolute control over another person's existence. The question of why he finally stopped, why he'd said during the trial that he'd enjoyed it and would have continued if allowed, raises interesting speculation about what would have eventually ended his operation if Odette hadn't intervened. Would he have kept killing until he died of natural causes, racking up hundreds of victims over decades? Would he have eventually made a mistake large enough that even the most dismissive law enforcement couldn't ignore it? Would the social conditions that enabled his operation have evolved in ways that closed the opportunity as record-keeping improved and communication between jurisdictions became more reliable? We'll never know, because Odette Thibodeaux paid attention, kept records, and found someone willing to listen. But the thought experiment is worth considering because it illuminates how much of public safety depends on private vigilance. on individuals noticing and reporting and insisting that their observations matter, on the willingness of authorities to take seriously reports from people who might lack official status but possess crucial information. The legacy of the Bayou House murders extends beyond criminal justice into discussions of social responsibility and the importance of believing people, particularly women, when they report patterns of concern. Odette was initially dismissed because she was a woman, because her evidence was observational rather than physical, because the authorities had been trained to discount intuition and pattern recognition in favor of concrete proof. The fact that she turned out to be absolutely correct, that her careful observations revealed a serial killer operating in plain sight, should have revolutionized how law enforcement approached missing persons cases and witness testimony. In some ways, it did, in small incremental ways, but the larger lesson about believing and investigating reports from marginalized voices took much longer to penetrate institutional thinking. There's a memorial of sorts now, not at the location of the Bayou House, but in the lobby of the Terrebonne Parish Courthouse. It's a small plaque listing the names of known victims, the ones who were identified from Odette's journal and other records. 23 names representing at least that many lives cut short. Below the names is a simple inscription that reads, "They were strangers far from home, and they deserved better than they received." It was installed in 2007, more than 130 years after the crimes, part of a larger effort to acknowledge historical injustices and remember victims who'd been forgotten. The plaque was Odette's idea, or rather, it came from her journal, from an entry she'd written after the trial where she'd expressed sorrow that the men who died at the Bayou House would be remembered, if at all, only as victims, as statistics in a criminal case, rather than as people who'd had lives and hopes and destinations they'd never reached. She'd written their names carefully in her journal, adding brief descriptions when she could remember them, trying to preserve some sense of their individuality against the homogenizing effect of mass murder. It was a small act of dignity, done privately in a journal she never expected anyone to read, and it stood in stark contrast to Prosper Guidry's treatment of them as nothing more than raw material for his compulsions. So, what are we left with? A case from 1872, solved and prosecuted and concluded. The killer executed, the building burned, the location reclaimed by swamp, a set of archived documents that researchers occasionally pull out and study, a small plaque in a courthouse lobby that most people walk past without reading, and questions that persist across the decades about how many similar cases went undetected, about how social disorder creates opportunities for predation, about the importance of paying attention and keeping records and insisting on being heard when something feels wrong. The Bayou House murders remind us that monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious signs. Sometimes they wear ordinary faces, run successful businesses, greet you with a smile, and offer you a clean bed after a long day on the road. Sometimes the only thing that separates a victim from a survivor is whether they happen to travel alone or in a group, whether they arrived on a night when the moon was dark or when it was bright enough to make the killer cautious. Sometimes survival is just luck, and the horror of that randomness is almost as disturbing as the deliberate evil that created the danger in the first place. Prosper Guidry hanged on a September morning in 1873, and the world moved on as the world always does, absorbing the horror and filing it away in the category of historical crimes, terrible but safely distant, something that happened to other people in other times. But the mechanisms that enabled his crimes, the social conditions that created a population of vulnerable transients, the institutional skepticism that dismissed early warnings, the general unwillingness to believe that ordinary-seeming people might harbor extraordinary evil, all of those elements remain, evolving in form but not in essence. And somewhere, in other times and other places, other predators are recognizing opportunities, identifying vulnerable populations, creating systems that allow them to satisfy their compulsions while minimizing risk. They're not operating boarding houses in isolated bayous anymore. The specifics have changed, but the fundamental pattern persists because human nature persists. Both the capacity for evil and the social conditions that sometimes enable it to flourish unchecked. The question Odette Thibodeaux's story poses across all these years is whether we're paying attention, whether we're keeping records, whether we're willing to insist on being heard when something seems wrong, even if we can't immediately prove it. Because sometimes the difference between dozens of murders and dozens of prevented murders is a single person who notices a pattern and refuses to dismiss it, who documents what they observe and finds someone willing to investigate, who understands that their intuition matters even when it contradicts official explanations. So tell me, have you ever had that feeling, that sense that something was wrong even when everything seemed normal on the surface? Leave a comment and let me know. And if you've got a story that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up, share it. You never know who might need to hear it, who might be in a situation where they're trying to decide whether to trust their instincts or dismiss them as paranoia. The Bayou house is gone, reduced to nothing, reclaimed by the swamp that spawned it. Prosper Guidry is gone, executed and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the prison cemetery. The victims are gone, most of them never identified, their stories lost except as statistics in a case file. But the lesson remains, carved into the historical record, like Odette's careful handwriting in her journal. Pay attention. Keep records. Insist on being heard. Because sometimes you're the only thing standing between a predator and their next victim, and whether you act or stay silent might determine if someone lives or dies. The Bayou country hasn't changed that much. It's still isolated, still dark at night, still capable of swallowing secrets whole. The roads are better now. Communication is easier. Record-keeping is more thorough. But the fundamental isolation remains. The sense that you're far from help and no one would hear you scream. And every now and then someone driving through at dusk sees the ruins of those brick pillars rising from the vegetation, or thinks they do, before realizing it was just shadows playing tricks, or was it? Because the thing about places soaked in that much horror, they don't just vanish when you knock down the building and salt the earth. Something remains, call it memory or atmosphere, or just the accumulated weight of all that suffering. Something that makes the air feel heavier, makes your skin prickle, makes you want to keep moving, find somewhere else, anywhere else. Prosper knew it, said as much in his final words, warned them to abandon the place entirely because nothing good would grow there again. And he was right, at least about that, whatever else you can say about him. So the next time you're traveling through unfamiliar territory and you're tired and you see a sign advertising rooms at a price that seems too good to be true, maybe pause for a moment. Ask yourself why the price is so low, why there are vacancies when everywhere else is booked, why something about the place makes your stomach tighten, even though you can't point to anything specific that's wrong. Trust that feeling. Keep driving. Find somewhere else. Because hospitality should feel welcoming, should put you at ease, should make you feel safer than you did on the road. And when it doesn't, when something underneath the smile and the clean sheets and the reasonable rates feels wrong, that's your instincts trying to save your life. Listen to them. Odette did, and it kept her breathing when 23 others stopped. That's not a coincidence. That's not luck. That's awareness protecting you from dangers your conscious mind hasn't fully recognized yet. The Bayou house served its last guest in September of 1872, when Silas Devereaux checked in and never checked out, when his disappearance finally triggered the sequence of events that would reveal Prosper Guidry's carefully maintained facade for what it was, a thin veneer over systematic evil. And in some way, Silas's death served a purpose, became the evidence that convinced Marshal Whitmore to dig deeper, to look beneath the floorboards, to find the truth that everyone else had been content to ignore. It's cold comfort, knowing that your death might prevent others, but it's the only comfort available to victims who never knew they were being selected, were being measured, were being prepared for a fate they couldn't have predicted or prevented. The files on the Bayou House case are available to researchers at the Louisiana State Archives. Boxes of documents detailing the investigation, the trial, the execution. They're consulted occasionally by students and writers and investigators studying historical crime patterns. The photographs taken of the crime scene, grainy and difficult to look at, document the excavation of the spaces beneath the house, the careful exposure of remains, the mapping of burial locations. They're difficult to view, not just because of what they show, but because of what they represent, the casual disposal of human lives by someone who viewed murder as a sustainable enterprise. Odette's journal sits in a different archive at the Louisiana Historical Society, preserved as an example of citizen documentation that led to criminal conviction. It's been digitized now, available online to anyone interested in reading a first-hand account of recognizing evil in progress and trying desperately to make someone listen. Her handwriting is remarkably clear, her observations detailed and specific, her growing concern evident in the progression of entries from mild unease to absolute certainty that something terrible was happening, and no one would believe her. Father Marceau's letters about his conversations with Prosper remain among the most disturbing documents in the case file, not because of any specific revelation, but because of the cumulative portrait they paint of someone entirely lacking in empathy or remorse, someone who viewed other people as objects to be used and discarded, who felt no connection to the human community beyond what was necessary to maintain his facade. The priest had tried, in his limited way, to find some spark of humanity in Prosper, some point of connection that might allow for redemption or at least understanding, and had found nothing, just a cold calculation of benefit and risk, pleasure and consequence, entirely divorced from any moral framework. The question that haunted Father Marceau for the rest of his life, the one he returned to repeatedly in his later writings, was whether someone like Prosper Guidry could have been prevented from becoming what he became, whether intervention at some earlier point might have redirected those impulses toward something less destructive. It's an unanswerable question, mixing philosophy and psychology and theology into something that defies resolution. But it's worth asking because it points toward the larger issue of how society should respond to people who seem fundamentally different in their moral architecture. The legal system of 1873 had limited options for dealing with someone like Prosper. The concept of rehabilitation through incarceration barely existed. Mental illness defenses were primitive and rarely successful, and the general understanding of criminal psychology was still in its infancy. The tools available were essentially guilt or innocence, punishment or execution, with very little middle ground. So Prosper was found guilty and hanged, the system functioning as designed, eliminating a threat but learning nothing from it, asking no questions about how to prevent the creation of similar threats in the future. Modern criminology might handle the case differently, might study Prosper more thoroughly, might try to identify early warning signs that could help predict and prevent similar crimes. But even with all our advances in understanding criminal behavior, we're still left with fundamental questions about human nature, about whether evil is something that emerges from circumstances or whether it exists as a basic orientation in certain individuals, whether intervention can truly change someone or just suppress their impulses until opportunity arises. These are not comfortable questions, and they don't have satisfying answers, which is perhaps why the Bayou house case continues to disturb people more than a century after it concluded. It's not just the body count or the methodology, it's the fundamental challenge to our assumptions about human nature. The demonstration that someone can function normally in most contexts while harboring desires and compulsions that most of us find literally incomprehensible. Prosper ran a business, paid his employees, maintained his property, was by all accounts polite and professional in his dealings with townspeople, and used that normalcy as cover for systematic murder. The cognitive dissonance that creates, the difficulty of reconciling those two aspects of his existence never fully resolves. And maybe that's the real horror of the Bayou house, not the specific crimes, but what they reveal about the possibility that ordinary facades can conceal extraordinary evil, that the person serving you dinner or renting you a room or sitting next to you on the train might be fundamentally different from you in ways that won't become apparent until it's too late. It's a paranoid thought, certainly, the kind of thinking that could paralyze you if you let it, but it's not entirely wrong either. Most people are exactly what they seem, ordinary folks trying to get by, but some aren't, and the challenge is distinguishing between them without becoming so suspicious that you lose the ability to function in society. Odette managed that balance somehow, maintained enough openness to work for Prosper for 2 years, while staying alert enough to notice the patterns that everyone else missed. She didn't assume the worst of everyone, didn't see danger everywhere, but when the evidence accumulated to a certain point, she trusted her observations over her desire to believe everything was fine. That's a difficult balance to strike, between caution and paranoia, between awareness and fear, but it's essential for navigating a world where genuine threats exist but are vastly outnumbered by false alarms. So, what do you believe? Do you think evil is something that people become, or something they already are, just waiting for opportunity? Leave your thoughts in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how people think about these questions, how you reconcile the existence of people like Prosper Guidry with your general understanding of human nature. The sun sets over the Bayou country much the same now as it did in 1872. The light turning golden, then red, then purple, before darkness settles in, complete and absolute. The sounds are the same, frogs and insects and night birds creating a chorus that masks other sounds, that makes it impossible to hear anything unusual unless it's very close and very loud. The cypress trees still stand in black water, their branches still heavy with Spanish moss, and the land still has that uncertain quality, never quite solid, never quite liquid, always in transition. And somewhere in that landscape, in soil that's been worked over by time and rain and vegetation, fragments remain, pieces of lives that ended violently and were buried without ceremony, without mourning, without anyone to mark their passing, except a woman who kept careful records in a small journal she hid from her employer. Those fragments are part of the Bayou now, absorbed into the ecosystem, recycled into new life. And if that provides any comfort at all, it's the comfort that nothing is truly wasted, that even horror eventually feeds something else, that death returns to the soil, and the soil produces new growth endlessly. The Bayou House murdered 23 men that we know of, possibly more, across 3 or 4 years of operation. Prosper Guidry was arrested, tried, convicted, and executed. Odette Thibodeaux lived a long life and died of natural causes. Marshal Whitmore completed his investigation and moved on to other cases. The building burned and the land was reclaimed, and the story became history, filed away in archives and remembered primarily by specialists who study such things professionally. But the questions remain, hanging in the air like Spanish moss, never quite settling, never quite resolved. Questions about how we recognize evil when it wears an ordinary face, about how we protect vulnerable people when society is structured in ways that make them invisible, about how we balance suspicion with trust in our daily interactions, about whether some people are fundamentally different in ways that make them incompatible with civilized society. These aren't abstract questions. They're practical considerations that affect how we move through the world, how we assess risk, how we decide when to trust our instincts and when to dismiss them as paranoia. Odette faced those questions every day she worked at the Bayou House, every time she found another abandoned belonging, every time she chose whether to speak up or stay silent. And her choices, her willingness to pay attention and keep records and insist on being heard, eventually saved lives, even though she couldn't save the men who'd already died. That's worth remembering, worth honoring, worth keeping in mind the next time you're in a situation where something feels wrong, but you can't quite articulate why. Your attention matters. Your observations matter. Your willingness to speak up and insist on being taken seriously matters. Because sometimes you're the only person in a position to notice the pattern, to connect the dots, to raise the alarm before more people die. The Bayou House is gone, but the lesson remains. Pay attention. Trust your instincts. Keep records. Speak up. And if you're ever traveling through unfamiliar territory and you see a place advertising hospitality at prices that seem too good to be true, maybe pause for a moment and ask yourself, why? Because sometimes the best hospitality is the kind you decline, the room you don't rent, the meal you skip in favor of pushing on to somewhere that doesn't make your stomach tighten for reasons you can't quite explain. That's the legacy of Prosper Guidry and the Bayou House, a reminder carved into Louisiana history that monsters exist, that they don't always announce themselves, that sometimes they offer you a clean bed and a hot meal before they end your life, and that the only thing protecting you is awareness, caution, and the willingness to listen when every cell in your body is screaming that something's wrong. Stay safe out there, pay attention, and we'll see you in the next one.